Well, welcome to this live Innovation Forum podcast. I'm Ian Welsh. Joining me today, Judson Whiteside, CEO of Stormfisher Hydrogen. Welcome, Judson.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for having me.
I'll turn to Judd in a second, but we want to hear from all of you on the call as well. You can interact with us using the Q&A function. Put your questions in there, like other questions if you like them, and I'll be putting those to Judd as we go through the conversation over the next 30 minutes or so. All right, Judd, welcome. Why don't you start by giving us the two-sentence introduction to Stormfisher?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Stormfisher has been around since 2006. We started off in the biogas sector, so taking organic food waste and turning it into renewable electricity originally, and then moved into the renewable natural gas market in North America. And back in about 2018, we sold that business and we ended up looking at how we could scale it. Food waste is very tricky and there's only so much of it to go around. And so we decided, looking at some European technology at the time, that we really liked the e-fuel space and what was happening with electrolysis-derived fuels. And so we started essentially a new business called Stormfisher Hydrogen, and we've been very active in the North American market as a project development company for both e-methanol and e-methane projects, as well as direct feed green hydrogen projects as well.
Okay, so tell us a bit about the fuels that you produce then.
Yeah, so we are very big on producing fuels that there's existing infrastructure and existing off-takers for these molecules. So we've focused primarily on e-methanol. So that's essentially electrolysis-derived methanol. So it's essentially green hydrogen. We take biogenic CO2 and we pair those together, and we can make e-methanol, or we can do something very similar and we can make an e-methane. Why we like e-methanol is because it is an existing chemical that's well established today. It's a top 5 moved chemical today in the world, typically derived from natural gas. So we make it in a more sustainable, renewable fashion. What we're seeing is a large presence of movement in the maritime sector, in particular, for e-methanol to be a future fuel for large ocean-going vessels. And there's a number of policies in Europe that's driving that, as well as the IMO has tabled some very significant policy that's driving decarbonization of large ocean-going vessels. And a lot of the ocean-going vessel companies have chosen methanol as their future fuel, if you would, for decarbonizing their fleets. And methane, why we like it so much, is essentially when we say e-methane, it's essentially a natural gas equivalent molecule. So it is pipeline spec natural gas equivalent in terms of the look and feel of that molecule. And so you're able to inject it. It's very similar to renewable natural gas, which we've sold for well over a decade here in North America to both utility customers as well as industrial customers trying to decarbonize their pipelines, and industrial customers from a consumption standpoint, from their scoped emissions. And so we like that quite a bit because the existing infrastructure is in place. We essentially, on the back end of our projects, we inject our molecules directly into natural gas pipelines in North America. And then that gas can go anywhere in North America, which is really unique for natural gas, because you can wield it anywhere across North America, as well as through LNG pathways and existing LNG facilities through traditional book and claim on the environmental attributes. And we're seeing a large market for that type of molecule in Japan, for example, in terms of utilities trying to decarbonize, and large industrials in Japan trying to decarbonize their natural gas consumptions.
Okay, so the electrolysis, basically the hydrogen that you're used to put into to create these fuels is created from electrolysis of water. How do you do
Correct.
that?
Yeah, so to make it green, if you would, it requires renewable electricity. And so why we like North America is North America, I would say, is very much a global leader in terms of the quantity and the quality of renewable electricity throughout the grids, whether it be in the way the electricity markets are structured. So places like ERCOT in Texas has a deregulated electrical market, so we can contract directly with wind and solar developers, which is quite unique in the world. Or in Canada, for example, we have a significant amount of hydroelectricity across multiple provinces. And so we have an abundance of clean electricity that's produced today. And it's really interesting. What we are finding is it's kind of unique. Electricity is very hard to move, and you can't export electricity very easily across the world. So by making a domestic molecule that can actually be transported around the world, it's a way of using abundance of electricity, renewable electricity, and actually making a product that can benefit both domestic as well as international markets from North American.
Given that carbon dioxide is released when your fuels are burned, what makes them carbon neutral?
Yeah, so they're being produced today and being released to atmosphere today. So we're essentially borrowing the molecule to make a molecule. If you just stopped at hydrogen, I think as people are familiar with the space, hydrogen is a very tricky molecule to handle. It's the smallest molecule in the world. And so it's very hard or very expensive to liquefy it and move it long distances. It doesn't tend to move very well just in that base molecule itself. So by pairing it with CO2 that's being produced today, so when we say CO2, typically what we like, because of the end markets that we're selling into, is what we call biogenic CO2 sources. So that's CO2 derived from organic substances that are essentially being produced. So like ethanol, for example, we would take the CO2 that's produced off an ethanol facility, which is a very clean CO2. It's biogenic in nature. And then we would pair that with our green hydrogen. And yes, it gets released on the back end, but it's being released to atmosphere anyways by those existing facilities. So we're not creating net new CO2 in our molecules that are being burned or consumed.
Apologies, I was on mute. You think I've never done this before. Audience, please be thinking about your questions and put them into the Q&A box, and we'll come to them a little bit later on. Okay, your fuels you've developed, methanol and methane. You talked a little bit about the markets you're looking at. Can you tell us a bit more about the markets that you're targeting?
Yeah, so we are very big on, I would say, commercially de-risking our projects early on. We don't kind of just a lot of developers, I think, view the engineering elements of projects as being the biggest risk item to the projects. We really try to de-risk the projects on the commercial side as much as possible early on before kicking off, feed, for example, because those are very large dollars, and we don't like to have those dollars at risk. That's part of our project gating that we try to adhere to internally, and I think that's really helped us. But so the markets that we sell into are primarily driven by policies that are affecting them in terms of penalties that are coming down. So, for example, RFNBO, we make an RFNBO certified molecule for the EU maritime sector, and that's being driven by policy in terms of penalties that the maritime sector is going to face. It's already started and it continues to ramp into the 2030s. And essentially, if the shipping industry or any vessels that are touching European waters do not use lower carbon fuels compared to, say, diesel or bunker fuels that they're using today to power their ships, the penalties are quite significant to those organizations. And so it's forcing them to look for alternative pathways and finding those molecules. I think the unique thing for us is um, Europe doesn't have enough energy or electricity to supply its own needs. And we do in North America. We have a lot of, as I said earlier on, a lot of renewable electricity available to us. And it's kind of unique as it's another export market that North America has to sell into to Europe in particular for methanol to help them decarbonize. And they need to look internationally to satisfy the growing demand. And it's significant. These ships consume a lot of fuel. And so when you bear it down to an electrolysis or a megawatt equivalent of one of our projects, two ships can almost consume the entire amount of molecules coming out of one of our, 100 to 200 megawatt equivalent projects of their annual fuel consumption. So it's quite interesting to see. We're seeing growing demand for these molecules, but there haven't been enough projects that have come online to supply them. And it's a little bit of a gap right now, but we continue to see strong demand for methanol on the maritime side. And then methane's really unique because it's a molecule that's much more well understood, certainly from a domestic North American marketplace. So there's gas utilities in North America that buy RNG today, have RNG mandates, and we've sold into those before, but they're continuing looking for more, and their mandates are growing in terms of the percentage of renewable gas that they have to find. maritime. And so that's why we liked going into this marketplace originally, was because we saw this a way of scaling, compared to, say, the traditional RNG sources. And then what we've been finding, as well as I mentioned, is in Japan, they're looking for, very hard domestically for them to supply low carbon molecules. So they're looking for international markets to help them with their decarbonization efforts at the utility level in particular.
Okay, apologies. My video is a little bit glitchy, so apologies if you're getting some glitchy video.
I can hear you fine, so that's okay.
Great. Okay, so let's talk about cost. What is the kind of cost comparison for example, the methanol you're talking about for maritime use compared to bunker fuel?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a green premium to the product. There's no doubt it's much more expensive than, the traditional gray fuels that these companies are consuming today. But what we're seeing is, that the appetite to pay for that green premium only continues to grow. I think what we're also seeing is a lot of the corporate customers of the shipping industry, and you're seeing this with airlines, with SAF, for example, very similar. You're seeing a lot of corporate buyers or corporate clients of the maritime sector pushing for lower carbon solutions for their products to come over, say, the Atlantic to North America or across the Pacific, right? And so what we're seeing is it's kind of happening two ways. One, on the policy side, it's driving through penalties, significant penalties that are essentially making it, that green premium, smaller and smaller in terms of the ability for the shipping companies to take. And then on the other side, their customers, like I'll use auto carriers as an example. A lot of the automotive companies now are looking for lower carbon solutions on their scoped emissions throughout their value chain. They're being forced to do that essentially through their ESG initiatives. And so they're asking their shipping companies for lower carbon fuel solutions to ship their products across the world. And so it's kind of happening at both angles, where their customers are willing to pay a premium. Some customers, not all, but some customers are getting there. And then on the other side, it's a policy landscape that's also pushing for them to get there because of the penalties that are associated with it.
I guess that with the growth of products that are regarded as emissions free, electrical vehicles being a prime example, buyers of them are not then necessarily going to want to think about the embedded footprint in their transportation and the manufacturer. So I guess car manufacturers are increasingly going to want to have emissions-free transportation for car parts and assembled vehicles.
Correct. And, for certain products, if you think about it, the additional cost on a per vehicle amount to ship with, e-methanol versus diesel, for example, the pass through to the consumer, I think, to their consumer, in order for them to market it as a fully green, life cycle, if you would, on the logistics of that vehicle, that EV that they're buying from Europe, say, and someone's buying it in North America. Essentially, that premium is really marginal because the overall cost, it's quite a bit of a small cost in terms of the overall bill of material, or the overall cost of the vehicle itself. So they're able to pass that through to consumers in order for them to hit their scoped emission targets as well. So it's a good story for a lot of these brands, and that's who we're seeing right now be the leaders in the space. I'm not saying every company is doing that right now. It's certainly not. But that's where I would say the leaders in the space are thinking about it when they're looking at products like that we're making, like e-methanol, for example.
Okay, so we're in uncertain times at the moment, to say the least, and certainly investors don't like uncertainty when thinking about funding, particularly for alternative projects, whatever the potential upside may be. How is this best countered, do you think?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. Certainly the hydrogen industry, and anyone who's been following it over the last 3 years, certainly in, say, 2022, when the Inflation Reduction Act in particular came out, and there was 45V for us in the United States. What we saw that drove, I would say, globally, all governments to that the PTC that the US government came out with in terms of the dollar value, in terms of the price reduction for the green premium that we could get. was very much world class, and I would say it still remains world class today in terms of the value, in terms of trying to drive growth in the industry. And so a lot of countries like Canada had to follow suit with their own type of programs to try to attract investors for projects like the projects that we build. And so it really drove the whole industry, and there was a lot of pent up, I would say, hype around the industry back in 2022 into 2023. And, all of a sudden, what we saw was, we've been in the industry a long time, building projects and selling clean molecules, but it felt like now everybody, and their uncles were hydrogen developers. So whether it be renewable energy companies that have never made molecules before, they thought it was a way for them to essentially have more wind projects built and solar projects built by having a large electrical load on the back end of their facilities, whether it be traditional petrochemical companies or oil and gas companies. Everybody now was a clean hydrogen developer. And what we've seen in the policy landscape, particularly in North America, is as there's been more uncertainty around the policy, a lot of the, I would say, 1 foot in, 1 foot out hydrogen development companies have gone away. And they've kind of gone back and retreated back to their core businesses. And that's been really good for us because I think it's allowed the real developers, the ones who have the experience, to kind of continue on and level set the expectations in the industry about what these projects are like, what offtake prices, real offtake prices are, because we back in 2022, there would be you talk to a customer and say, well, we can get a molecule for this price from this developer. And anyone who is really a true developer and understood the project economics and behind would sit there and say, how's that even possible? And so it created this expectation that I would say was unfair, unrealistic. No different than when I lived in the solar bubble, if you would, and everyone was a solar developer, back, that was back 20 years ago. We saw a similar type of bubble be created and expectations in the industry. And once there's consolidation, and I would say change in policy or uncertainty a little bit, it leaves us with the real, I would say, the real developers left. And so we're in that space, and we see a lot of opportunities for projects now in the marketplace because the demand for the molecules continues to grow from what we're seeing. And I think that's been really good.
You mentioned 45V just now. Could you, just for those of us, including me, not totally clear what that is, could you just explain what exactly that is?
Yeah, so in the Inflation Reduction Act, essentially it's an incentive for hydrogen, green hydrogen. And so there's certain attributes and a scaled system to get the full credit, but essentially it's a $3 per kilogram. So any green hydrogen that you produce, you get a $3 per kilogram tax incentive on that molecule produced. So it's quite significant, if you can imagine, to get that money back from the U.S. Treasury. And so it's very similar. It's under the same umbrella program that's driven the renewable energy boom in the United States for wind and solar, battery energy storage. It's under the same umbrella program, but there was a new program created under the Biden administration specifically for the hydrogen, the clean hydrogen economy.
Okay, we do have a question on 45V. Questioner asks, to the extent that you see the US still as a potential supplier to the EU markets, given the clawback in the 45V provisions?
Yeah, so from our standpoint, I would say it's been a whirlwind of a year following policy in the US since the beginning of this year. There was a point where 45V was essentially terminated by Congress, and then the Treasury came out with their guidance, and that's where it stands today, where what we have to be is essentially in construction for our projects. It doesn't mean a project has to be fully built. It really means a start of construction and commitments, financial commitments for equipment, for example, by the end of 2027. And so for us, in terms of, we've been developing projects in the US for the last 3 years. So we have a healthy pipeline of more advanced projects. And so we still see an opportunity for us to be able to hit within those timeframes. What it means, though, is it's not going to have a tail of a problem. What used to be, we thought, be a volume of a portfolio of projects that we could have between now and say 2035 that we'd be executing on. It's a shorter window, so that means there's going to be fewer projects that actually can get built. But that's the current policy landscape right now. But we also, policies change, different administrations change. The industry in general, we're not a speed industry. It takes time for us to build our projects and actually get them commissioned, multiple years. And so we try to take a longer term view, and we continue to look for other opportunities that I would say are more unique in the US market that can maybe move faster under the current policy landscape, but also take a longer term view in terms of where we can look for project locations that we think over time might just be the right locations, as the industry grows and policy might adapt over time.
So you talked about locations. You are developing locations all the time. You're in Texas and Kansas. What sort of reaction do you get locally to your facilities?
I think that's the really unique thing. Locally, it's really exciting when the communities we've been talking to when we're talking about our projects for them. I think what's unique about hydrogen and the e-fuel space is if you're in the green space, you really need renewable electricity. And a lot of the markets where renewable electricity is the best, so Southwest Kansas, for example, tends to be areas where there's just not a lot of large industry. But the wind blows the best in Kansas, and the solar is abundant, and it's very good, for example. But the communities are quite small because they're typically agricultural and rural in nature. And so when we come to them and say, "Hey, we want to locate, beside this wind project that's going to be built, again, more investment in their communities, and beside a solar project that wants to be built." And we're going to be here for 20 plus years, and we're going to create 30 full-time high paid high skilled jobs, and a number of hundreds of construction jobs, through hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. That's game changing for those communities that we're developing in, because they just don't have a lot of large industries looking to go there, because it just hasn't been the case in the past. And so it's been a very good story. And I think nationally or federally, when you think about it too, what a success story that is. You're using domestically created electricity that there's abundance of, and sometimes it's not needed. Often in the grids that those are located, there's just not enough load in those areas for how much production is being driven. And we're making molecules that can either be used domestically or can be used internationally, and sold internationally, is a really unique story that I tend to find politicians really resonate with.
Okay, thank you. What sort of level of scale is required to get close to price parity with traditional, with the traditional fuels that you're providing alternatives for?
Yeah, I mean, parity is really tricky, I would say. I mean, scale won't ever really get to where I think you're, at least where the current, natural gas prices are in North America in particular, I would say. It's very, very hard for us to compete against that. It's just not going to happen anytime soon, in my opinion. And certainly scale, there's only so much scale that can really get you to a lower cost molecule before introducing more challenges, primarily around when you're looking at, say, gigawatt size electrolysis projects. We don't tend to play in that game. Why? Is because we have a lot of experience in understanding how to contract renewable power and interconnections. And our view is that that's just very, very challenging. It's almost a hurdle that's too hard to overcome to hit very tight, very, green tolerances in terms of the molecules we're making. So we tend to find that, again, based on our analysis and a lot of modeling exercises that we've done, both from our engineering teams, but also our renewable energy groups and our financial analysts, around 100 to 200 300 megawatts is the max that we will go for our projects. So our projects typically average in between the 100 to 200 megawatt size of electrolysis equivalent installation capacity. And that allows us to connect, and it sizes well to traditional kind of the average size wind farms in North America, as well as solar farms in terms of what you see, without causing so much chaos for utilities. When you go to a utility and you say, I need to connect a gigawatt of load in an area, that is so significant. In some cases, that could be 30 to 40% of their overall load in certain markets. And so it really is almost too large for them to really know how to handle, or the infrastructure upgrades that are needed to connect that type of load is too cost detrimental to the overall project economics. So that's where we tend to play in size wise.
Okay, given that you use excess electricity, do you have to be then flexible as to when you turn on and off your facility? Because I would imagine you won't necessarily know when there's going to be excess energy, or do you? Can you predict?
There is ways through a lot of advanced modeling now to have better indication. You might know day ahead, for example, that the next day is most likely going to be a curtailment episode for us. We typically, instead of using alkaline electrolyzers for that very reason, we use PEM. And PEM is a lot more flexible in terms of going up and down, in terms of ramping. And so we do play in what we call demand response programs for utilities. And that also helps our project economics because you can get meaningful revenue dollars for shutting down or lowering your load during those peak demand times across North American markets in particular. And so we do try to play in those as much as possible. And so it's yes, it is something and it's a good story too, right? Because we're helping the grid in times when there's excess electricity, we can consume that electricity. And in times when they need that electricity for other load users or residential, for example, we're able to lower that and actually really work well with the utility on longer term solutions for helping their grid dynamics.
Okay, question from our audience. You talked about air travel briefly. In your view, how feasible is green air travel?
So we aren't, none of our projects right now are in what they call sustainable aviation fuels or SAF. So I believe that's probably what the question is referring to. There's a number of projects. What we've looked at, there's methanol to SAF producers and technology out there. And so we've been talking to a number of those potential customers of ours where we would be selling methanol and they would be converting it into sustainable aviation fuels in Europe in particular. And so something that we've been keeping a very close eye on. But there's multiple technologies to do that, whether it be like alcohol to jet, for example. We're seeing more of that in North America. It could be bio-based fuels into SAF. But certainly there seems to be a lot of appetite from the corporate buyers or the corporate customers for a lot of airlines. You're seeing offtake contracts being signed. But we're not right now in that space ourselves, primarily because we're not as familiar with the technologies, although we continue to investigate those and we look at projects. And so it's not a no. It's for us, we're kind of looking at it and trying to understand if it's something that we want to get into more. But certainly the market is there and it seems to be growing from our view.
And in fact, we did talk about sustainable aviation fuels an hour ago in our previous live podcast. That will be published, edited version will be published on the Innovation Forum website shortly. What about road fuels? Question from the audience. What about road fuels then?
Yeah, so we've stayed away from road fuels. I mean, traditional road fuels from a hydrogen standpoint is, through fuel cell applications. We've seen a lot of challenges with that. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue, is what we've seen as part of the problem in North America. A lot of projects that have failed or truck makers that have failed, and a lot of it ties back to, is it the infrastructure that needs to get built out first, or is it the equipment that needs to be built out first? And is there enough buyers of both of those things to sustain the industry? And that's where we've seen a lot of challenges. If you look at the California market, for example, there's been lots of trials and tribulations in that space, and we've just stayed away from it. It's also not as scaled. We look at larger size projects for our offtake lens.
And I guess the vehicle market or the road vehicle market and electrification has, and development of EVs is probably going to be the way that market goes.
Yes, I think there will be applications for larger vehicles. We looked at, mining, for example, is looking at hydrogen applications, some, I would say, more bespoke, unique transportation areas. But certainly in North America, electric vehicles has really taken over. But there might be some commercial applications that are there for sure. And we're all for it. I hope it does continue to grow. It's not that we're not against it. It's just not in our development platform.
Sure. All right. Well, I'm conscious we're coming towards the end of our time. Can you give us a bit of your best guess then at how the mix of alternative fuels and traditional ones is going to develop over the coming decade?
Yes, I think, Ian, it's interesting. I think when people talk about the energy transition, I got this sense, and I think a lot of people in the industry get the sense that sometimes think that's going to happen in a 5-year period or a 2-year period. It's going to happen very quickly, and it's going to take decades. There's no doubt about it. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint in transition, and it's going to take time for the industries to change and consumers to adapt. And so I'm in favor of, and we're always advocates for, we need it all. So whether it be bio-based molecules, whether it be E-based molecules that we make, electrification, decarbonization is going to have to take multiple pathways for all of us to get there. And that includes electricity generation as well. Nuclear, you're seeing a resurgence of nuclear. It's needed. There's just so much demand for electrons and for decarbonizing molecules now that it's going to take multiple pathways for society to get there. But it's going to take time. But what we're seeing in the hydrogen space is a lot of investment is happening. It does not getting as much limelight, I think, as it probably needs. There's been a lot of, I would say, negative press around our industry. But what we're seeing, and there's facts to support it, is there is a lot of investment and there's a lot of green hydrogen projects that are hitting FID, especially over the last 2 years. And so the industry is growing. It's just going to take time. And it's not going to happen as fast, I think, as people were thinking it would, which might feel like a failure, but I don't think that's the case. Our view is that was always going to be the case. It was going to take time, and it's going to continue to take time to evolve and to adapt.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Judd Whiteside from Storm Fisher, for taking us through some of the applications or use of green hydrogen in developing new fuels. Look out for more podcasts in the Future of Fuels series, and we'll be continuing the conversation at the inaugural Energy Transition Innovation Forum in Amsterdam in April 2026. Do get in touch with us for full details about that. But for now, my thanks to Judd. I've been Ian Welsh.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Yeah, bye.